I blinked and it was done. No exaggeration. One moment the large man was standing, and the next he was on both knees, on the floor of a steakhouse, gasping for air. I have witnessed confrontations in my restaurant over the years, bar fights, drunken arguments that spilled into the dining room, but what I saw that night was nothing like any of those. This was not a fight. It was more like watching someone flip a switch and cut the power to a room. The glass hit the tile first. It shattered in a clean, almost musical burst, the kind of sound that stops a room mid-sentence. Forks froze in midair. Conversations collapsed. Every person inside Caruso's steakhouse turned toward the back corner where one man stood over a table, fists still clenched, and another man sat without moving, napkin folded neatly across his lap, watching the aggressor the way a cat watches a dog that has wandered too close to its territory. When the large man walked through the door, I felt it immediately. 4 decades in the restaurant business teaches you to read the energy of a room before anyone speaks a word. I glanced at Saul behind the bar, and we both understood, without saying anything, that this man had not come in looking for a meal. What took place inside that restaurant on a warm Thursday evening in September 1969 never reached the newspapers. There were no cameras, no journalists, no official record of any kind. Just a handful of people eating dinner in a quiet section of West Los Angeles, and 2 men whose collision produced a moment so striking that the witnesses carried it with them for the rest of their lives. The year was 1969, and America was in the process of consuming itself. The Vietnam War had crossed a line that no politician's words could paper over. More than 40,000 American soldiers had already returned home in coffins. The Tet Offensive the previous year had demolished whatever remained of public trust in the institutions running the conflict. Demonstrations erupted across university campuses. Draft cards were being burned in the streets. And underneath all of it, a quieter kind of damage was spreading through American culture. The enemy had been given a face, and that face was Asian. It did not matter that the war was being fought in Vietnam. The hostility spread outward in every direction. Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, none of them were exempt from the fallout. Slurs that had gone dormant since the internment camps of the Second World War were surfacing again with renewed venom. In certain parts of Los Angeles, a man with East Asian features could not walk into a bar without sensing the room shift against him the moment he stepped through the door. This was the America that Bruce Lee moved through every single day. He was 28 years old. He had come to the United States nearly a decade earlier, a lean teenager from Hong Kong with a foundation in Wing Chun and an ambition that most people would have called unrealistic. His role as Kato in The Green Hornet had made him a recognizable face on television, but the series had been cancelled after 1 season, and Hollywood had responded to his ability with the same comfortable indifference it extended to anyone who did not fit its preferred image of a leading man. By September of 1969, Bruce Lee existed in an unusual kind of limbo. He was well known enough to be recognized on the street. He was training some of the most influential people in the entertainment industry, and yet the film world continued to treat him as a novelty rather than a headliner. He had developed Jeet Kune Do, a martial arts philosophy built on directness, efficiency, and the rejection of rigid tradition. He was teaching it out of his schools in Los Angeles and Oakland, but the frustration was real and constant. He channeled it into training, into writing, into private journals where he worked through questions of identity and direction. He was a man suspended between 2 worlds, considered too Chinese for Hollywood and too Americanized for Hong Kong, and the pressure of that position was shaping everything about who he was becoming. On the evening of September 11th, Bruce Lee drove to Caruso's steakhouse by himself. Caruso's was not a glamorous establishment. It occupied a commercial stretch of Pico Boulevard, wedged between a dry cleaner and a shoe repair shop, with a worn red awning out front and a neon sign that hummed in the evening air. Inside it was dim and comfortable, wood-paneled walls, red leather booths, candles set in glass holders on every table, the aroma of charbroiled beef and garlic bread drifting through the space. Bruce arrived around 8:30. He was dressed plainly, dark slacks, a fitted black shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his forearms. Even in simple clothing, there was something about him that drew the eye. It was not his physical size. At 5'7" and 140 pounds, he was smaller than most of the men in the room. It was the quality of how he moved. Each step was deliberate, carrying a contained energy that seemed always on the edge of release. His eyes swept the room as he entered, the automatic habit of a martial artist cataloging every space, every exit, every possible variable. He ordered a steak, medium rare, a side of vegetables, and a glass of water. He took out a small book and began reading. The restaurant was roughly half full that evening. A couple in their 50s sat in the booth nearest the front window. Two younger women shared a bottle of wine near the center of the room. A heavyset man in a wrinkled suit occupied a seat at the bar, watching a baseball game on the small television mounted in the corner. And in the booth, directly across from the bar, an older gentleman sat alone, working through a plate of spaghetti with methodical focus, glancing up occasionally to take in the room with quiet, attentive eyes. By every measure, it was an unremarkable evening. That changed at approximately 9:15. The door opened, and a man named Ray Dawson walked in. He was difficult to miss. 6 feet 2 inches tall, 220 pounds, with a chest that pressed against the fabric of his denim jacket and hands that looked built for damage. His hair was cut close in a military style, and a thin, pale scar ran along the left side of his jaw from the earlobe to the chin. He moved with the deliberate bearing of a man whose body had been trained to command space, and his pale blue eyes swept the restaurant the way a predator reads a landscape before making its approach. Ray Dawson was 32 years old. He had completed 2 tours of duty in Vietnam with the United States Marine Corps. He had been part of the fighting in Hue during the Tet Offensive, block by block, building by building combat that had left wounds far more lasting than the scar on his face. He had come home in the spring of 1968 to a country that showed no interest in receiving him. There were no ceremonies, no acknowledgement. Protesters confronted soldiers at airports. His own brother had called him a murderer at a family dinner. The Marine Corps had provided Ray with structure and brotherhood, and civilian life had offered him nothing in return except a succession of dead-end jobs, a failed marriage, a small apartment in Culver City, and a dependence on whiskey that deepened with every passing season. The anger had always existed inside him. In Vietnam, it had kept him alive. But at home, it had no purpose and no outlet. It built pressure behind the walls of him like rising water behind a dam, looking for any crack it could find. And somewhere in the months since his return, that anger had settled on a target. The Vietnamese had killed men he cared about. The Vietnamese were Asian. The logic was blunt and tribal, and it required no sophistication to take hold. He was far from the only man carrying it. A companion, a former corporal named Eddie Sloan, followed him in. The two of them took seats at the bar and Ray ordered bourbon. For the first quarter hour, nothing happened. When the large man walked through that door, I felt it in the room immediately. I looked at Saul, and we both understood that this man had not come in for dinner. Ray drank, Eddie talked. But Ray's attention had drifted to the back of the restaurant, where a compact Asian man sat reading alone, eating his steak with the unhurried ease of someone entirely at peace with his own company. Ray studied him the way a man stares at a problem he has not yet committed to solving. It began with volume. Ray's voice started to rise, not into shouting, but pitched at that deliberate register designed to carry across a room. He talked about Vietnam, about what those people were really like, about how a man could not sit down for dinner in his own country without having to share a room with one of them sitting there like he belonged. The couple near the window exchanged a glance. The two women stopped laughing. The man at the bar shifted in his seat. The older gentleman in the corner booth looked up from his plate, fork suspended, and watched. Bruce Lee heard every word. He did not raise his eyes from the book. He did not tighten visibly. He simply continued eating. But beneath that stillness, something was functioning at a speed most people would never recognize. Bruce had spent his entire life learning to read men like Ray Dawson. As a teenager in Hong Kong, he had learned to sense aggression the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. In Oakland, he had fought a private and now legendary match against a kung fu master who had tried to shut down his school for teaching non-Chinese students. In Hollywood, he had absorbed 1,000 quiet humiliations. He understood what was building across the restaurant. There was a particular frequency to men in this state, a vibration of focused hostility he could detect without looking directly at its source. The question was never whether the confrontation would arrive. The question was when, and what Bruce would decide to do when it did. He chose to wait, to observe. This was the foundational principle of Jeet Kune Do: do not move until the moment makes it necessary. And when movement is required, commit to it completely. So he sat, and he tracked Ray Dawson's reflection in the window glass beside his table, mapping every shift in posture with the precision of someone who had spent years training his attention. Then Ray stood up. He crossed the dining room with the heavy, deliberate stride of a man who had already made his decision. Eddie remained at the bar, visibly uneasy. The bartender, a broad-shouldered man named Saul, reached beneath the register for the phone but did not pick it up. Ray stopped at Bruce's table. He stood over it, his shadow falling across the open book. Bruce looked up. Their eyes met. What Ray found looking back at him was a smaller man with dark, steady eyes that carried no fear, no hostility, no visible reaction of any kind that he could use as leverage. It was like looking into water that showed no bottom. "You lost," Ray said. It was not phrased as a question. Bruce closed the book and set it beside his plate. "I don't believe so. The food here is quite good. Have you eaten?" The civility caught Ray off balance. He had walked over expecting confrontation. "I didn't ask about the food," he said, leaning in, one hand pressed flat on the table. "This isn't your kind of place." "My kind of place," Bruce repeated, as though examining the phrase from several angles. He lifted his water glass and took a slow sip. "And what kind of place would that be exactly?" "Don't act like you don't understand me." Ray pulled out the chair across from Bruce and sat down without being invited. "Let me keep this simple," he said, his voice dropping into a low, controlled register. "I spent 2 years in the jungle with those people. I didn't come home to watch you sit in an American restaurant acting like you have a right to be here. Finish your meal, settle your bill, and leave, or this becomes something neither of us needs tonight." The restaurant had gone fully silent. The couple by the window had stopped pretending not to listen. The older gentleman had set down his fork and was watching with the focused attention of someone who understood precisely what was unfolding. Bruce looked at Ray for a long, unhurried moment. "I am sorry for what you endured," he said. "War strips something essential from a man. I can see clearly what it has done to you, but I am not your enemy. I never was, and I am not going to leave." For a fraction of a second, something moved behind Ray's eyes, a hairline fracture in the hardness. Then the bourbon and the pride and the accumulated weight of years sealed it shut again. "Wrong answer," Ray said. He rose from the chair. It scraped against the tile floor. His hands gathered into fists, not the loose, impulsive fists of someone who had drunk too much at a bar, but the tight, compact fists of a man trained in close-quarters combat. Bruce remained in his seat. He looked up at Ray with the same undisturbed expression he had worn since the man walked over. And then, in a moment no one in the room anticipated, he smiled. It was not theatrical. It was not meant to provoke. It was the quiet smile of a man who had encountered this exact situation many times and had long since understood not only its mechanics, but the sadness driving it. "Sit down," Bruce said, his voice low and even. "You do not want to do this." "Don't tell me what I want." "I'm not telling you what you want. I am telling you what is going to happen. You are going to throw a punch. I am going to redirect it. And after that, the evening gets significantly worse for both of us. There is no version of this that works in your favor. So sit down, let me order you a drink, and we talk like two reasonable men." The offer held in the air. For 3 full seconds, every person inside that restaurant remained completely still. Then Ray Dawson made his choice. His right hand came forward in a straight cross, aimed directly at Bruce's jaw, thrown with the full rotation of the hips behind it. It was the kind of punch that had ended bar confrontations clean from Da Nang to San Diego, the kind that dropped men before they understood what had happened. It did not land. What followed lasted less than 4 seconds. Those who were present would later struggle to describe it accurately, not because the sequence was complicated, but because it moved at a pace the human eye could barely register. Bruce transitioned from seated to standing in a single connected motion that seemed to bend the ordinary rules of how bodies move. His left hand met Ray's incoming wrist, not stopping it, but getting it to the side the way a practiced hand guides a heavy door, borrowing Ray's own momentum and redirecting it past Bruce's head. This was the core of Jeet Kune Do in physical form. The intercepting fist. Meet the attack while it is still forming. Manage it before it reaches you. Ray's fist passed Bruce's ear and connected with nothing but air. The redirection pulled him forward and off balance, his weight fully committed to a strike that had found no target. In that razor-thin interval between intention and recovery, Bruce struck. A straight lead punch, his signature technique, refined over years of obsessive practice to a level of mechanical precision that bordered on the inhuman, connected with Ray's solar plexus. The punch traveled no more than 6 inches. But the force behind it was generated by the entire body in sequence, foot, hip, shoulder, arm, fist, firing in a chain so rapid that the impact it produced was vastly greater than the distance suggested. Ray's body folded. The air left his lungs in a single sharp burst. His hands dropped to his midsection, grasping at a pain that had arrived before he even registered the movement. Before Ray could fall, Bruce's right hand came forward and caught the front of his jacket, not to strike him again, but to manage his descent. He guided Ray downward in a controlled motion. Simultaneously, Bruce's left foot swept cleanly behind Ray's lead ankle, a simple, efficient technique that removed the last of Ray's foundation. Ray Dawson, 6'2", 220 pounds, two-tour in Vietnam, a man who had survived some of the most brutal infantry combat since Korea, went down to both knees on the floor of Caruso's steakhouse with a sound that carried across the entire room. The full sequence, from the moment Ray threw his punch to the moment both knees touched the floor, had taken 3.8 seconds. The restaurant exhaled in a single collective breath. The woman near the door covered her mouth with her hand. Her companion half rose from her seat, then sat back down, uncertain of what was happening. The bartender gripped the phone. Eddie Sloan sat frozen on his stool, mouth open, his glass untouched. The older gentleman in the back booth had not moved at all. He simply sat and watched, his expression one of pure, concentrated astonishment. Bruce Lee stood over Ray Dawson with both hands at his sides. He was breathing at a normal rate. His face carried no visible sign of exertion, no flush, no elevated energy, no trace of satisfaction. He had the composed, professional expression of someone who had just completed a task that fell comfortably within his ordinary range of competence. Ray remained on his knees, pressing both hands against his midsection, forcing air back into lungs that had momentarily forgotten their function. His face was flushed, and his eyes had begun to water. And somewhere beneath the pain and the disorientation and the bourbon still moving through his blood, something new was making its way to the surface. Something Ray Dawson had not encountered in a very long time. Real fear. Not the operational fear that sharpens a soldier in the field. Something more primal than that. The recognition that he had placed himself in the path of something operating on a level so far above his own that the difference was not measurable in degrees, but in kind. Everyone in that restaurant waited for the same thing, the finishing blow, the kick that would put the aggressor on his back and complete the arc of the story the way stories like this are supposed to end. Bruce Lee did not complete that arc. He stepped back. He gave Ray room. And then he did something that stayed with every person present for the rest of their lives. He extended his hand. "Get up," Bruce said. His tone was calm and direct, the same voice one might use to help a colleague off the ground after a stumble. "Come on, get up." Ray stared at the outstretched hand. Every instinct remaining in him said to push it away. But those instincts belonged to the man who had walked through the front door 20 minutes earlier, and that version of Ray Dawson no longer existed in quite the same form. Ray reached up and took the hand. Bruce lifted him with a steadiness that made clear there was significant strength behind it, and guided him back into the chair across the table. He turned toward the bar. "Sal, 2 waters, please." The bartender hesitated, receiver still in hand. Bruce offered a brief nod. "It's fine." And Sal set the phone down, filled 2 glasses, and brought them over. Bruce pushed 1 glass across the table toward Ray. "What's your name?" "Ray, I'm Bruce. Where did you serve?" The directness of the question free of any judgment or performance of sympathy, stopped Ray completely. "Hugh," he said, his voice unsteady, "and Ki-san." Bruce nodded once slowly. Hugh was devastating. "You don't know anything about it." "You're right, I don't, but I recognize what it looks like when a man is carrying something he cannot set down. You have been carrying it since the day you came home." Ray said nothing. The muscles in his jaw moved silently. "The war took something from you," Bruce continued. "It took your sense of peace, and ever since you returned, you have been trying to locate something to hold responsible. But I am not the one who took it, Ray, and causing me harm tonight will not return what was lost." The words fell into the silence of the restaurant like stones entering still water. Ray's clenched fists gradually opened on the table in front of him. "I lost people over there," Ray said. The words came out fractured. "Good men, some of them were barely adults. They didn't make it back and I did. I came home and there was nothing waiting for me. My marriage ended. My family stopped speaking to me. I can't sleep. I cannot stop being furious at everything." "I know," Bruce said, and the absence of elaboration in those two words, delivered without ceremony or performance, but with something unmistakably genuine, made clear that he meant it. Not the specific experience of the jungle or the firefights or the nights that followed, but the central feeling, the displacement, the exhaustion of living between two identities and belonging fully to neither. The anger of a man who has been formed by something the people around him cannot see or reach or understand. Bruce Lee knew that condition in a way that required no translation. "Let me tell you something," Bruce said, leaning slightly forward. "Anger is not the problem. Anger is energy. The problem is where you point it. Right now your anger is consuming the structure of your own life from the inside. You are standing in a fire you built yourself and wondering why everything keeps burning." Ray's eyes glistened. He blinked against it. "You need to learn to redirect it," Bruce said. "Aim it at something that creates rather than something that destroys. That is not softness. That is discipline. And discipline is the most powerful form of strength a person can develop." The room remained suspended around them. The couple by the window sat listening without any further pretense of doing otherwise. The two women had set their glasses down. Eddie had drifted to the far end of the bar. The older gentleman in the back booth had not moved, his spaghetti long since cold, watching the exchange with an expression that occupied the space between wonder and grief. Bruce tapped the table once, a light and deliberate gesture. "Go home tonight, Ray, rest. And if you decide tomorrow that you want to do something different with what you're carrying, come find me. I teach martial arts, not to prepare men for conflict, but to help them understand themselves. The address is in the phone book. Bruce Lee, Chinatown." He paused, and the edge of something like humor passed briefly across his face. "I won't bill you for this evening." Something shifted in Ray Dawson's face then. It did not soften entirely. The lines were too deeply set for that, but the arrangement changed. The tectonic structure of it rearranged into something that was no longer looking for a target, no longer armed with the same hostility that had walked through the front door. It was the face of a man who had been struck in the body and addressed in the soul, and was not yet certain which had left the more lasting impression. He stood slowly. He looked at Bruce for a long moment, a look weighted with things that did not have available language. Then he gave a single nod and walked toward the door. Eddie followed. The night air moved briefly through the restaurant, and then they were gone. The room came back to itself. A dozen people remembered how to breathe at more or less the same moment. The bartender picked up the telephone, looked at it, and replaced it in its cradle. The women at the center table began speaking in fast, overlapping sentences. The man at the bar finished his bourbon in one swallow. Bruce Lee straightened his napkin, picked up his utensils, and went back to his steak. He ate at the same pace he had maintained before any of it happened. He reopened his book. To anyone who had walked in off the street at that precise moment, he would have appeared to be nothing more than a man finishing a quiet dinner alone, which was exactly what he was. The situation had been resolved. The steak was still good. The older gentleman in the back booth watched Bruce for another few minutes. Then he signaled the waitress, settled his bill in cash, and left a substantial tip. On his way out, he passed Bruce's table. The two men held eye contact for a brief moment. The older gentleman offered the slightest nod, the kind that carries acknowledgement and respect and the recognition of something witnessed and fully understood. Bruce returned it. No words passed between them. The older gentleman walked out into the September evening and disappeared into the street. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened at Caruso's moved through the informal networks of Los Angeles martial arts community. The details shifted in transit, as they always do. The number of aggressors increased. The techniques became more elaborate, but the essential truth at the center of it remained unchanged. A man had walked into a restaurant and attempted to drive Bruce Lee out of it. And Bruce Lee had responded not only with a level of physical precision that defied easy description, but with something that extended far beyond the mechanics of combat. What remained with people afterward was not the speed, extraordinary as it was. It was not the technique, flawless as it appeared. What stayed with them was the ending, the hand extended to a man who had come with the intention of causing harm, the conversation that followed, the invitation offered to an enemy. It was a living demonstration of the philosophy Bruce had been constructing for years. Jeet Kune Do had never been only a fighting system, it was a framework for self-knowledge. For removing everything that was excess, every wasted motion, every technique kept out of habit rather than utility, every limitation accepted without examination, until what remained was the clearest possible expression of who you actually were. Absorb what is useful, release what is not, add what is genuinely your own. Bruce had articulated this principle in every school he had ever run. On that night at Caruso's, he demonstrated it in real time. The interception of the incoming strike before it could develop full force. The fluid response calibrated to the specific reality of the moment rather than any predetermined sequence. The restraint applied with the same precision as the technique itself. He had measured the response exactly to what the situation required, and nothing beyond that. Bruce Lee could have broken Ray Dawson's arm. He could have fractured his jaw. He could have delivered a kick powerful enough to send a 220-pound man through the wall of the restaurant. He made none of those choices. The solar plexus strike had been calculated to stop, not to injure beyond what was needed. The ankle sweep had been designed to control the fall, not to punish it. The decision to hold back, to apply exactly the minimum necessary force and not a fraction more, was the most sophisticated technique Bruce used that entire evening. Bruce Lee left Caruso's around 10:30. He paid his bill, left a tip that the waitress would later recall as more than generous, and walked to his car in the parking lot. He drove home through the quiet streets of Los Angeles with the windows open, the warm September air moving through the car, the scattered lights of the city spread out beneath a sky where no stars were visible. There is no written record of what he thought about on that drive. No journal entry that names the evening, no letter that references it, no interview where it surfaces. But those who knew him with any depth, those who understood the ongoing conversation he maintained between action and philosophy, believed that the encounter with Ray Dawson had confirmed something Bruce had long held to be true, that the most significant contest a man could win was one that ended without hatred on either side. Within 4 years, he would become one of the most recognized figures on the planet. He would return to Hong Kong and break box office records across Asia. He would complete Enter the Dragon, a film that would introduce martial arts cinema to Western audiences at a scale and with an impact that had no precedent. He would become an icon, a cultural reference point, a presence whose influence reached across film and philosophy and the way generations of people afterward understood the possibilities available to them in their own bodies and minds. And then on July 20th, 1973, at 32 years old, he was gone. The world mourned a man it had barely begun to know. But on that September evening in 1969, Bruce Lee was alive and largely unknown. He was eating a steak in a restaurant where a stranger told him he did not belong. And he demonstrated, through what his hands did and through what his words said, and through the choice he made when he could have made a very different one, that he belonged anywhere he decided to be. The incident at Caruso's was never filed in any newspaper. It appears in no biography. It lived only in the memories of the people present, a small group of ordinary Americans who, on an ordinary Thursday night, witnessed something they did not have the vocabulary to fully name. They saw a man refuse to be made smaller by hatred. They saw a person trained for violence choose something harder than violence, and they did not forget it. Ray Dawson did not appear at Bruce Lee's school the following morning or the morning after that. But there are people who say, and this is the kind of thing that cannot be confirmed, only carried quietly, that some weeks later, a tall man with a military haircut and a thin scar along his jaw was seen standing outside the door of Bruce's Chinatown studio, looking through the window at a class in session. He stood there for some time, then he turned and walked away. Whether he ever returned is a story that belongs entirely to him. What is not in question is this. On a night when the world gave Bruce Lee every available reason to respond with the full force at his disposal, he chose something else. He met hatred with precision. He met aggression with composure. He met cruelty with a quality of compassion so unexpected and so direct that it moved through defenses that no technique could have reached. In a country that spent considerable energy trying to define him by the surface of his appearance, Bruce Lee defined himself by the depth of what he chose to do when the choice was entirely his. And on that night at Caruso's steakhouse, in a city still burning from a war it could not resolve, one man showed a room full of strangers what it actually meant to be unbreakable, not because he was beyond being wounded, but because he chose not to wound in return.